High school sweethearts vanished in 1983 road trip. Decades later, a deserted motel room gets unsealed. For 37 years, their families waited for answers. But what a demolition crew found behind the motel's sealed door would finally expose. A truth no one expected. The morning sun had just begun to rise over the quiet town of Ashwood, Colorado. A sleepy little place barely marked on most maps. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Or at least, they used to. Time had passed. New buildings stood where old shops once did. Gas prices had changed. Families had grown. And yet, for some in Ashwood, one mystery remained frozen in time. A haunting absence that never healed. The disappearance of Parker and Julia Monroe, Insay. The spring of 1983, they were young, in love, and full of life. Evan, a senior at Ashwood High, captain of the basketball team, tall with an easy smile that made girls blush. Julia, a junior, beautiful in a simple way, with her long dark hair always tied in a ponytail and eyes full of warmth. They were the kind of couple everyone quietly rooted for. High school sweethearts destined to marry. Their relationship blossomed in the hallways of Ashwood High, during late-night phone calls, under the bleachers after practice, and on weekend drives down. Scenic mountain roads. They talked about college, marriage, children. It was all unfolding the way small-town fairy tales usually do, until one weekend changed everything. On April 9th, 1983, Evan and Julia set out on a short road trip. Nothing extravagant. Just two kids escaping the pressures of high school finals, seeking a little adventure. They packed up Evan's powder blue 1971 Dodge Dart, borrowed from his uncle, stuffed with snacks, maps, and a cheap Polaroid camera to capture memories. Their plan was to drive 3 hours west toward Red Pines National Park, stay at a roadside motel overnight, and return home by Sunday. They never came back. By Monday morning, their parents called the police. The search began immediately. Roadblocks were set up. Helicopters were brought in. Search parties combed through the winding roads, cliffs, and forests that led to Red Pines. News crews arrived, turning Ashwood into a temporary media circus. Flyers with their smiling faces were posted at every gas station, grocery store, and diner across Colorado. But there was no trace of Evan or Julia, no sign of the Dodge Dart, no witnesses who saw them after they left Ashwood that Saturday morning. The case quickly turned cold. Whispers spread like wildfire. Theories bounced around town. Maybe they ran away together. Maybe it was a botched robbery. Maybe someone they met on the road had darker intentions. Years passed. The posters faded. The news vans disappeared. But the pain for their families never lessened. Birthdays came and went. Empty chairs remained at holiday dinners. And hope dwindled like a candle burning its final wax. By 1995, the Parker and Monroe families had exhausted every private investigator they could afford. Police officially labeled it a cold case. The mystery of Evan and Julia's disappearance had quietly become part of Ashwood's dark folklore, a story parents warned their kids about. But life in Ashwood marched forward. New businesses opened, people moved in and out, and by 2020, very few residents even remembered the couple who once graced the cover of missing person flyers. That was until the demolition. In the spring of 2020, the long-abandoned Whispering Pines Motel, located on the outskirts of town, was finally scheduled for demolition. Once a popular stop for travelers along Highway 17, Whispering Pines had fallen into decay. Shattered windows, collapsing roofs, rusted signs, vagrants, drifters, and rumors of illicit activities had plagued it for years. The town council approved its teardown to make way for a gas station chain. A crew arrived one chilly March morning, ready to begin clearing the old structure. As workers started ripping apart the dilapidated building, they made a discovery no one anticipated. Behind a rotting wooden partition on the east wing, sealed tightly behind what appeared to be decades-old drywall, was a single locked room. Room 3B, a room no one knew existed. The door was heavily rusted. but the lock surprisingly intact. The workers paused. The foreman, Dennis Halbrook, called the town sheriff before proceeding. Within an hour, Sheriff Louise Donnelly arrived at the site. She was in her late 50s, a no-nonsense woman who'd grown up in Ashwood and still carried the scars of its unsolved mysteries. And like most locals her age, she remembered Evan Parker and Julia Monroe very well. Standing before the sealed door, she had a gut feeling, one she'd hoped never to face again. "Get the locksmith," she ordered. "We're not busting." This open. Within 20 minutes, the old lock finally gave way. The door creaked open under years of pressure, releasing a stale, suffocating wave of air. What lay inside stopped everyone in their tracks. The room was perfectly preserved, as if frozen in 1983. A faded floral bedspread covered the queen-size bed. On the nightstand sat a beige rotary phone, a half-used pack of Marlboro cigarettes, and a disposable camera. A thin layer of dust coated every surface. 2 suitcases rested near the dresser, one blue, one floral. An open purse sat on the desk, still containing a student ID card belonging to Julia Monroe. A men's leather wallet lay nearby, the initials, EP, embossed in the corner. On the bed sat 2 carefully folded varsity jackets. Ashwood High School, class of 1983. Sheriff Donnelly stared at the scene, her throat tightening. She radioed in backup and ordered the site sealed immediately. The media storm reignited overnight. News trucks swarmed Ashwood. The Parker and Monroe families, now in their 70s, were notified. For 37 years they had waited. Now, pieces of their children's lives were suddenly, painfully, returned to them. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives began the long task of documenting every inch of room 3B, photographs, fingerprints, DNA samples. The room had been untouched for nearly 4 decades. No forced entry, no struggle, no bloodstains. Yet the question loomed larger than ever. How did this room remain hidden all these years, and where were Evan and Julia? The room itself offered no clear answers. Both suitcases contained personal items exactly as their parents remembered. Clothes, toiletries, even Julia's favorite book of poetry. The disposable camera still had undeveloped film inside. That single roll of film would soon become critical. Forensic teams carefully extracted it, rushing to a specialized lab capable of salvaging decades-old negatives. After several tense days, the photos were finally developed. The images were chilling. Most of them were innocent snapshots. Julia smiling at a rest-stop diner. Evan pumping gas into the Dodge Dart. A selfie of them laughing with mountains behind them. But the final frame was different. The last photo was blurry, taken in dim lighting. The motel room was visible, but they were not alone. Standing near the bed was a tall man, blurry, his face barely visible, partially obstructed by Evan's shoulder. But one detail was clear. The man's hand was gripping Julia's wrist. A sense of unease filled the room as the photo was analyzed. Who was he? And why was that the final photo on the roll? Sheriff Donnelly stared at the photo for a long time, her fingers lightly tracing the outline of the unknown man. She had seen thousands of crime scene images in her career, but something about this one felt uniquely disturbing. It was as if the photo captured a moment neither Evan nor Julia intended to record, a snapshot of their final hours. The investigation accelerated. The original motel owner, now deceased, had sold Whispering Pines in 1985, shortly after the couple's disappearance. But old property records revealed something odd. A series of private cash sales, each under different shell companies, had kept the property changing hands for years, masking its true ownership. Someone had intentionally kept Whispering Pines isolated, unvisited, and unrenovated for nearly 4 decades. But who and why seal off one specific room? Sheriff Donnelly pulled the old case files from storage, yellowed pages, grainy black and white photos, long-forgotten witness interviews. She pored over them late into the night, cross-referencing names, addresses, and inconsistencies. 1. Name reappeared multiple times. A name she hadn't focused on back then, but couldn't ignore now. A man named Franklin Avery. Franklin was a handyman who worked maintenance at Whispering Pines in the early 80s. He was in his early 30s at the time. The original investigation had questioned him briefly. He claimed not to have worked the weekend Evan and Julia vanished, and no evidence linked him directly to their disappearance. But Franklin had vanished himself just a few years later, moving, out of state, his trail going cold. Sheriff Donnelly exhaled slowly, staring at the name. She ordered her team to reopen Franklin Avery's old employment file. And within hours, new unsettling details began to emerge. The reopening of Evan Parker and Julia Monroe's case quickly became the biggest event Ashwood had seen in decades. The small town was no stranger to rumors and tragedy. But this was different. This was personal. This was history pulling itself out of the grave. Sheriff Louise Donnelly sat in her office, the photo from the disposable camera in front of her. The blurry image of the unknown man gripping Julia's wrist haunted her thoughts. And now, the name Franklin Avery sat beside it, scrawled across old employment files in faded ink. A man whose involvement had once seemed irrelevant was now, suddenly, very relevant again. Back in 1983, Franklin was simply the handyman at Whispering Pines Motel, low-level maintenance, odd jobs, fixing leaky faucets, replacing broken locks, no criminal record. No personal connection to Evan or Julia. At least, none that had been discovered. But in the years after the couple's disappearance, Franklin had left Ashwood. Quietly, without much notice. His forwarding address led to a post office box in another state. And after that, nothing. No tax records, no known employment. It was as if he had simply dissolved into thin air. The renewed investigation quickly involved federal authorities. FBI agents arrived in Ashwood, bringing advanced technology and fresh eyes. Digital tools could now enhance and analyze the old photo far beyond what was possible in 1983. The blurry man's face was partially reconstructed using sophisticated software. It wasn't a perfect image, but it was enough. A comparison run through national databases returned a promising result. The reconstructed face shared several key features with Franklin Avery's last known driver's license photo, taken in 1985. The match was not conclusive, but it was highly suggestive. FBI agent Marcus Ellison, leading the federal side of the case, briefed Sheriff Donnelly privately. "We can't say with 100% certainty it's him," Ellison explained, "but this facial structure alignment gives us probable cause to locate him for questioning. If Franklin Avery is still alive, we need to find him." For Sheriff Donnelly, the chase was no longer theoretical. It was real. The search led investigators out of Colorado entirely. New records showed that a man using Avery's name had purchased property in remote western Montana nearly 30 years earlier. It was a small cabin, registered under an LLC that allowed Avery to live almost entirely off the grid. A task force was dispatched immediately. The cabin sat deep within the wooded outskirts of Mineral County. No neighbors nearby, no mailbox, no phone lines. Only a long rutted dirt road leading to a weather-beaten structure surrounded by dense forest. The team approached cautiously. Franklin Avery was alive, now in his early 70s. His once dark hair was fully gray, his build still lean, but his posture was slightly stooped. When agents knocked on his door, he opened it slowly, peeking through the cracked frame before allowing them in. "What's this about?" he asked, with a nervous, raspy voice. Agent Ellison calmly presented the warrant. "We have questions regarding events that took place in Ashwood, Colorado, back in 1983. For a brief moment, Avery's face went pale. But he composed himself quickly, inviting the agents inside. His cabin was simple, Spartan, a single bed, a worn recliner, a wood-burning stove, and sparse belongings. No photographs, no family mementos, nothing to suggest a rich personal history. The agents questioned him for hours. Avery maintained his innocence, claiming he barely remembered Evan or Julia. I heard about their disappearance like everyone else, he said, voice steady but eyes evasive. But I wasn't even working that weekend. But gaps in his story began to emerge. Old employment ledgers recovered from Whispering Pines Motel confirmed that Avery had, in fact, clocked in that exact weekend. A direct contradiction to his statement. Further, when presented with the enhanced photo from the disposable camera, Avery denied recognition. But the tightening of his jaw and subtle tremor in his hand suggested otherwise. "You've been hiding for a long time, Franklin," Agent Ellison pressed gently. "This is your chance to tell us the truth." Avery remained silent. With no confession yet, the agents proceeded to search the property. What they discovered next would reignite the case like gasoline to flame. Buried in a sealed trunk beneath loose floorboards was a collection of carefully preserved items. Set of keys belonging to Evan Parker's Dodge Dart. Julia Monroe's missing locket, engraved with her initials, a handwritten journal. The journal would become central to understanding the nightmare that had unfolded all those years ago. Forensic teams carefully photographed every page before transporting the journal to Ashwood for analysis. Sheriff Donnelly sat alone as she read through the haunting confessions written in Franklin Avery's distinct handwriting. The entries were disturbing. The journal revealed that Avery had been suffering from severe mental instability long before Evan and Julia's disappearance. Paranoid delusions filled the early pages. He believed young people staying at Whispering Pines were sent to mock him, that couples like Evan and Julia were part of a larger conspiracy designed to torment him. The most chilling entries were written just days before the couple vanished. April 6, 1983. They've checked in. The boy and girl. Laughing. Always laughing. They stare. Whisper. I see them. They know. April 7th. I followed them when they walked to the vending machine. Heard them mention my name. They pretend not to notice me, but they know. April 8th. Tonight it ends. I will make sure they never mock me again. And finally, April 9th. The room is sealed. They're quiet now. No one will find them. Sheriff Donnelly closed the journal, her hands shaking. The weight of those words was suffocating, but one mystery still remained. Despite the journal's confessions, no physical remains had ever been found. The room itself, while containing their belongings, had shown no evidence of violence or human remains. Where were Evan and Julia? Investigators returned to Whispering Pines, tearing apart every inch of the east wing. Floorboards were removed, walls scanned, foundations excavated, and then they found it. Beneath a false panel in the room's walk-in closet was a concealed crawlspace. Inside, wrapped carefully in plastic sheeting, were two sets of skeletal remains, undisturbed for nearly 4 decades. Dental records quickly confirmed the heartbreaking truth. Evan Parker and Julia Monroe had never left Whispering Pines Motel. They had been hidden under the very feet of investigators all those years ago. The town of Ashwood fell into collective mourning. News of the discovery swept across national headlines. The mystery that had haunted an entire generation was finally solved, but the closure was cold comfort to the families. The Parker and Monroe families held a joint memorial service, attended by nearly the entire town. Candles lined the streets, as friends, classmates, and strangers stood in silence to honor the 2 lives stolen so senselessly. Franklin Avery was arrested and charged with double murder. During his trial, he showed little emotion. His defense attorneys attempted to argue mental incompetence, citing decades of untreated psychological disorders. But the jury delivered a swift verdict. Guilty on all counts, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And yet, even as justice was served, Sheriff Donnelly found herself haunted by one final question. Why had no one thought to search that crawl space back in 1983? A simple concealed hatch had allowed a monster to hide his crime in plain sight. For years afterward, she would replay the case in her mind, wondering how close they had been. How many searchers had unknowingly stood just inches above where Evan and Julia lay entombed? The Whispering Pines Motel was demolished shortly after the trial, its cursed legacy reduced to rubble. In its place now stands a memorial garden, 2 stone benches side by side beneath flowering dogwood trees. A plaque bears their names, Evan Parker and Julia Monroe, forever young, forever remembered. The trial of Franklin Avery became national news. It was everything that true crime documentaries were made of: a decades-old disappearance, a hidden motel room, a sealed crawlspace, and a suspect who had spent nearly 40 years hiding in plain sight. The courtroom was packed as the Parker and Monroe families sat quietly, absorbing every word. The jurors listened intently to the forensic reports, the journal readings, and the expert testimonies about Avery's mental illness. But beneath the surface of the trial's steady rhythm, a strange tension began to rise. Because even though Avery had finally been brought to justice, there was something that wasn't sitting right with Sheriff Donnelly. The problem was simple, yet deeply troubling: the timeline. As she reviewed the case files again and again, she noticed small inconsistencies, things that most people wouldn't have paid attention to back in 1983, but now, with modern forensic timelines, didn't add up. According to the journal, Avery claimed to have lured Evan and Julia into room 3B, subdued them, and concealed their bodies shortly after. But the final entries of his journal were oddly calm for someone who had just committed double homicide. And then there was the film roll. The last photo of the man gripping Julia's wrist. That moment captured in the photo did not align with Avery's written confession. The man in the photo didn't resemble the frail and paranoid Avery from 1983. His build was different, his posture stronger. His face didn't fully match the computer-enhanced comparison to Avery's DMV record. The forensic experts had been so focused on the facial alignment that the body language had been overlooked. Sheriff Donnelly couldn't shake the suspicion that Franklin Avery may not have acted alone, or worse, that he may not have been the only person involved at all. As Avery began serving his life sentence, Donnelly requested that the FBI keep the case open for further investigation. She felt something larger had been missed. If there was another person involved, they might still be free. With that in mind, Agent Marcus Ellison dug deeper into Avery's past. They re-examined every hotel record, every maintenance log, and every interview that had been conducted in 1983, and that's when something deeply unsettling came to light. Back then, the Whispering Pines Motel had an unofficial manager, a man named Walter Granger. Walter had been the night clerk, responsible for checking guests in and out after 6 p.m. He lived on site in a small apartment attached to the motel office. In many ways, he knew that property better than anyone else. And while Franklin Avery handled maintenance, Walter handled everything else, including the records that would later go missing. Back in 1983, Walter had been interviewed briefly by detectives. But at the time, his alibi had seemed solid. He claimed he'd been out of town visiting his sister the weekend Evan and Julia disappeared. His sister, living 3 towns away, confirmed it. But now, as Ellison examined the case notes, he found an overlooked detail. Walter's sister had been struggling with early-stage dementia, even in 1983. Her testimony had been inconsistent, vague. When Ellison ran Walter's name through more recent databases, it painted a troubling picture. Walter had quietly left Ashwood just 1 year after the motel changed ownership. He relocated multiple times across state lines. For the past 15 years, he had lived in Idaho under an alias, Walter Graves. It was enough to warrant further investigation into. The early spring of 2021, a team of agents arrived at a small, isolated property in northern Idaho, a weathered house sitting along a dirt road bordered by towering pines. Walter Graves, formerly Walter Granger, answered the door. He was now in his late 70s, gray-bearded, thin, with tired but watchful eyes. The moment the agents presented their identification, He exhaled sharply, his face paling. Agent Ellison spoke calmly. "Mr. Granger, we need to speak with you about events that took place at Whispering Pines Motel in Ashwood, Colorado, in April 1983. Walter's shoulders slumped, and for a long moment he said nothing. Finally, his voice cracked. "I figured this day might come." Walter was escorted back to Ashwood for questioning. And under pressure, the truth began to spill. It was far worse than anyone imagined. Walter admitted that Avery had not acted alone. In fact, Avery had not planned the crime at all. It was Walter who had orchestrated everything. Walter explained that he had grown obsessed with Julia Monroe in the months leading up to the disappearance. He saw her multiple times when she accompanied her parents to the motel for family weekend getaways. His infatuation grew darker with each passing week. When Evan and Julia checked into Whispering Pines for their road trip, Walter saw an opportunity. He had been watching her for months. That night, Walter lured Avery into participating, using his unstable mental state against him. He convinced Franklin that Evan and Julia were part of a group stalking them, playing on his paranoid delusions. Once, inside room 3B, Walter incapacitated the couple and locked the door behind him. Avery assisted, manipulated into thinking they were protecting themselves from imagined conspirators. Walter had been the one who sealed the crawlspace, cleaned the scene, and falsified the motel's guest records. He made sure that room 3B was completely erased from the registry. He bribed the new owner when the motel was sold, ensuring that particular room was permanently sealed and forgotten. For decades, the truth remained hidden. Walter had escaped suspicion by crafting an airtight alibi using his sister's deteriorating memory as cover. While Avery lived in isolation and paranoia, Walter built a quiet, uneventful life in anonymity. "I was careful," he admitted to investigators. "I knew no one would question a missing record if they never even knew the room existed." When asked why he never confessed, Walter's response was chilling. "Because no one was looking for me." "You already had your suspect. The moment they looked at Franklin, I was free." As the full story unraveled, both families were forced to confront a level of evil they hadn't imagined. The community, too, struggled to process the fact that, for nearly 4 decades, a man who had once handed guests their room keys was the true mastermind behind Ashwood's greatest tragedy. Walter Granger was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of obstruction of justice. His age and declining health raised questions about whether he would live long enough to face trial. But Sheriff Donnelly didn't care about his lifespan. She cared about the truth finally being known. For many in Ashwood, the revelation was both horrifying and oddly relieving. The decades of rumors, theories, and half-truths could finally be put to rest. At the memorial garden where Evan and Julia's names were engraved, flowers appeared more often now. Strangers left notes of condolence. Former classmates visited, many for the first time in years. Sheriff Donnelly often visited that quiet place in the evenings. The sun would set behind the dogwood trees as she stood in silence, remembering 2 young people whose lives had been stolen before they truly began. In a world filled with noise and distraction, it was the quiet that weighed the heaviest. The Whispering Pines Motel was long gone, but its story would haunt Ashwood for generations. The trial of Walter Granger had begun to dominate headlines even more than Franklin Avery's. If Avery was the paranoid pawn, Granger was the calculating manipulator, a predator who had orchestrated every piece of the puzzle while hiding in plain sight for nearly 4 decades. But as the legal machine worked its way forward, there was one person who couldn't rest: Sheriff Louise Donnelly. For her, the unsettling part wasn't just what had happened. It was what still felt wrong. Walter had confessed in full detail how he targeted Julia, how he convinced Avery to help him, how he sealed room 3B, how he manipulated records to erase their presence from the motel's history. It all sounded complete. But Sheriff Donnelly couldn't escape one gnawing question: why seal the room permanently? If Walter simply wanted to hide a crime, Why not dispose of the bodies completely? Why create a time capsule, carefully preserved and hidden behind sealed drywall? It felt ritualistic, almost personal. With Walter behind bars, Donnelly requested one last forensic sweep of the Whispering Pines site, even though most of it had been demolished. The demolition crews had left portions of the East Wing foundation intact beneath, layers of debris. This time, the search was different. They brought in a specialized team using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging to scan for any anomalies under the remaining concrete slabs. And then they found something roughly 15 feet beneath where Room 3B once stood, deep inside an old storm drainage chamber that was no longer connected to the city's system. The radar picked up hollow spaces, large enough to hold more than just building debris. It was as if someone had constructed an entire subchamber, intentionally. The excavation was delicate. As layers of dirt and concrete were removed, the old sealed hatch emerged. Rusted, circular, bolted shut. Nobody had seen it during the initial investigations decades earlier. It was buried too deep, far below where the search teams had focused back in 1983. The hatch was pried open. Inside was not what anyone had expected. The chamber held dozens of personal items, souvenirs, trophies, remnants of other guests who had passed through Whispering Pines. Women's jewelry, watches, photographs, a child's stuffed animal, all tagged and organized neatly inside airtight containers, preserved from decay. It became clear that Walter Granger's sickness went far beyond Evan and Julia. Whispering Pines had hidden other victims. Victims no one had ever connected to any larger case because they had simply been categorized as missing persons across multiple states. Walter's confession hadn't revealed this part. His crimes extended much further, over many years. He hadn't just stumbled into darkness in 1983. He had been building toward it long before Evan and Julia arrived. The FBI reopened multiple cold cases from Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho. Names of women and children who vanished while traveling through small towns, families who had carried their own unsolved grief for decades. Some of the recovered items were matched to missing persons files through DNA analysis and serial numbers. But for others, no matches were ever found. For Sheriff Donnelly, the horrifying scope of the case left a permanent scar on her soul. Back in the county jail, when confronted with the new evidence, Walter initially stayed silent. His lawyer attempted to block further questioning, citing deteriorating health and mental competency concerns. But late one evening, Walter requested to speak with Sheriff Donnelly, alone. Inside the dimly lit interview room, he appeared more frail than before, his skin pale, hands trembling slightly on the metal tabletop. "They weren't supposed to find that," he whispered, almost as if embarrassed. Donnelly sat across from him, her voice even and calm. "You lied to us, Walter. There were more victims." He nodded slowly. "I didn't plan for it to last that long. At first, it was only about Julia. She reminded me of someone I lost when I was young." His voice quivered. "The others, it just became easier after that. Easier to hide. Easier to take control. Whispering Pines, it became my sanctuary." Donnelly felt her stomach turn. "You had help?" Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Only Franklin, and only that once. The rest, I learned how to handle on my own." For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the humming of the ceiling light. "You were right to keep looking," he added softly. "You always had the instincts." Sheriff Donnelly leaned forward. "There's more, isn't there?" Walter sighed. "Yes, but you'll never find them all." The final trial was scheduled. Multiple charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, and obstruction stacked higher than any judge had ever seen in the county's history. Walter Granger's crimes had spanned almost 2 decades before the motel was finally sold and sealed. He would never leave prison again. For the families of Evan Parker and Julia Monroe, closure came in painful waves. The memorial site was updated. Not just for Evan and Julia, but for the other identified victims whose stories had been buried in silence. The town of Ashwood, once defined by one unsolved case, was now the center of one of the largest serial predator cases in Colorado's history. The Whispering Pines Motel had always been cursed ground, but now its curse had a name. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Evan and Julia's deaths, Sheriff Donnelly stood quietly at the memorial garden. Spring blossoms gently swayed in the breeze as families placed fresh flowers beneath engraved stones. The plaque read, "For Evan, Julia, and all who were lost, may their voices never fade." As Donnelly stood there, she thought of all the times she had stood so close to the truth, yet couldn't see it. And now, finally, the weight of nearly 4 decades had begun to lift. The courtroom had fallen silent as the last verdict was read. Walter Granger was officially convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. For the Parker and Monroe families, the end had finally come. But closure, as they quickly learned, is a strange and complicated thing. Even with 2 men behind bars and a horrifying truth exposed, the emotional scars were not so easily sealed. The unanswered questions continued to haunt them in private moments, especially for Julia's mother, Eleanor Monroe. Several months after the trial, Sheriff Donnelly received a visit from Eleanor. The older woman appeared thin, worn down from years of heartbreak, but determined. "Sheriff, there's something that's been bothering me," Eleanor said, her voice soft but resolute. Donnelly gestured for her to sit. "Of course, Eleanor. What's on your mind?" Eleanor pulled an old, faded envelope from her purse and carefully laid it on the desk. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Julia's. "My daughter wrote this weeks before she and Evan left on that road trip. I found it while going through some of her old things recently. I never opened it before. I was too afraid to revisit all of it." Donnelly gently unfolded the paper. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Mom and Dad, I know you think I'm rushing into things with Evan, but I want you to know I love him. More than anything. We've been talking about starting fresh, maybe even sooner than you think. There's something I haven't told you yet. Someone's been following us lately, and we think it's nothing serious. Just some strange man who showed up at my part-time job last month, and again at the diner where Evan works. Evan thinks it might be someone from the motel, one of the staff who gives us odd looks whenever we visit. We haven't told the police because nothing's happened, but if anything ever does, please know we always tried to be careful. Love, Julia." Donnelly felt her stomach knot. This letter confirmed that the targeting had likely begun even before the road trip, far earlier than the investigators had realized. Walter Granger had likely been stalking Julia for months, building his sick obsession carefully, waiting for the perfect moment. Avery may have been lured into Granger's plan, but Granger had been hunting Julia long before they ever checked into Whispering Pines. Several weeks later, Sheriff Donnelly received another surprising call. The demolition crew, who had resumed clearing what was left of the Whispering Pines site, had made one final discovery. Beneath another section of concrete, buried even deeper than the secret trophy chamber, they had uncovered an old locked safe. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photographs. These weren't just souvenirs like the jewelry and watches. These were photographs of victims, women and girls, some smiling, some unaware, some visibly terrified, all photographed inside room 3B. And in several photos, Granger himself was visible in the background, posing as if documenting his twisted collection. There were more victims than anyone had feared. The FBI reopened additional cold cases, some as far away as Arizona, Nebraska, and New Mexico, confirming that Walter Granger's hunting ground had extended well beyond Ashwood's borders. He wasn't just a local predator. He had been a traveling serial killer operating for nearly 20 years, always circling back, to Whispering Pines as his personal storage facility. The national media erupted once more, dubbing Granger the Motel Predator. Documentaries were produced, investigative podcasts analyzed the timeline, and investigative journalists uncovered horrifying details long buried. Sheriff Donnelly, who had spent much of her career obsessed with one unsolved disappearance, now found herself the reluctant face of one of the most chilling serial murder cases in U.S. history. But for her, the media attention was irrelevant. What mattered was that the truth had finally surfaced. 1 year later, Granger passed away inside, prison due to complications from late-stage cancer. He left behind no remorse, no confession, and no further cooperation. With his death, so too died any lingering hope of finding all the unknown victims. Some families would never receive closure. Some names would remain missing, faces frozen on, old flyers tucked away in dusty filing cabinets. But Evan and Julia's story, the story that had started it all, had finally come full circle. In Ashwood, the memorial garden was expanded. New plaques were added to honor all the victims whose remains had been identified. The old grounds where Whispering Pines once stood were leveled and redeveloped into a peaceful park, a place for reflection, not horror. For Sheriff Donnelly, retirement soon followed. She had carried Ashwood's heaviest burden for nearly 40 years. And though she had delivered justice, the ghosts of the case would always remain with her. On her final day in office, she visited the memorial one last time. Spring sunlight streamed through the dogwood trees as the breeze gently rustled the leaves. Fresh flowers lined the memorial stones, and the sound of distant children playing brought an odd sense of comfort. She traced her hand along Julia and Evan's plaque. Forever young, forever remembered. Tears welled up in her eyes. Not just for Evan and Julia, but for all the lost souls Whispering Pines had claimed. And as she walked away that day, the weight of decades lifted, if only slightly, from her shoulders. The story was over, but Ashwood would never forget. Thanks for sticking with FlickerSoul Story until the end. If you enjoyed it, give this a like and share if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.